Good afternoon. We break into programming. Tom Green along with Alex Lewis because it is 3.5 years since the King Soopers shooting saw 10 people die. This afternoon, a Boulder County jury is returning a verdict.
Yeah, they went into deliberations Friday about 3 p.m. and now it is Monday, and that was kind of our expectation that the jury would figure out what they wanted to do with these 55 counts. And about 1:25 in just a few minutes, the judge will read that verdict.
There are 55 counts, so there's a lot to consider, but this case simply boils down to the question of whether or not the shooter, Ahmad Alissa, was sane or insane when he went into the store on that Monday afternoon and killed 10 people. So the consideration of what appears to be a rather short deliberation by the jury is something that a lot of people have been trying to interpret, but so many people have been waiting for this one piece of closure for this case.
I mean, 3.5 years, right? The case stalled for a couple of years when they were trying to determine the competency of Ahmad Alissa, who does suffer from schizophrenia. And that's what we saw with the closing argument, specifically from the defense and the prosecution going back and forth with that big question. We're giving you a live look as the jury reaches that verdict outside of the courthouse.
We are expecting again to get that information from the jury coming up in just a couple minutes. We're also joined now, Chris Vanderveen has been with us, and Chris has covered this cases and cases like it. And Chris, as we talked about, it really comes down to that simple question regarding sanity.
Yeah, this isn't really a trial about did he do it or did he not do it. That's really sort of the classic situation. That question is sort of central to jurors' mind. This is a case of was he insane or not at the time of the crime. We saw something very, very similar in 2015 with the trial of the man accused of going into the theater in Aurora, Colorado and shooting and killing 12 people. Similar type of situation where the jury was asked to distinguish what was in his mind. Not did he do it, but what was in his mind at the time of the crime. That is what the jury is deciding now, and that's what obviously now the jury has decided upon.
This case so large in Colorado, so large in the Boulder community, and it's been there for 3.5 years, but it wasn't until this trial that many of the victims' families actually sat in court and watched the murders of their loved one take place, or hear the testimony of police officers for the first time speaking about what they saw, heard, and all of these people have had to deal with in that time since.
Just a very, very difficult trial to walk through, to go through a lot of really graphic information. But at the same time, this is one of those trials where we didn't have a lot of information as to what was happening in his mind at the time, and we still don't really have a great motive in this case. There's been sort of theories that have been put out, but in terms of a specific motive, much like in some cases the theater shooting trial, we don't have a great motive.
And some of the details, I think, that have come out, which have been so striking. You heard one of the pharmacists who testified saying she heard him say, "This is fun, this is fun." When they're going through the trajectory of what happened on that day, you could see how he was hunting some of these people down, right? I mean, he was walking past some of the victims inside that grocery store who were laying down as he was targeting victims, chasing them down, shooting multiple times. And you hear those details, and it's even that much more difficult to fathom what family members are going through hearing that.
And that's the thing I think sometimes we lose focus on or track of in a trial like this. We think of it as a mass murder. For each of these families, it is an individual murder first and foremost. They think only of their loved one who, among the 115 people who were in the store, somehow these 10 were the ones unfortunate enough, or outside the store, as in the case of Nevin Stanisic, were outside the store at the wrong time, on the wrong day, on that Monday in March of 2021.
And there was just that singular decision by the shooter in this case to go to that grocery store on that day. It was just one of those situations where people were there clearly not expecting anything quite like this.
It'll be interesting to hear what comes after this. We've been hearing from some family members in the last few days, but I think for many, they may be seeking their finality to this part of their story. It has been a hard story, and it's gone on for quite some time.
Yeah, and we talked about all of the planning that went into this, which we also heard. Oh, I believe we're bringing in the jury. Do we want to go live? Okay, so this is all happening. Of course, some of the next steps is the jury will come in, they will be seated. You can see the shooter there seated, ready to hear his fate and the verdict come out. 55 counts, and there's been some discussion amongst us in the newsroom is how will this happen? Are they going to go through every single count? Of course, there are the 10 murder counts, and then there are several others with the other extenuating circumstances, attempted first-degree murder, extreme indifference, and the list goes on and on. But Chris, I'm curious, you've covered trials like this. Do you think we go count by count, or is this going to be one?
I would suspect you'll go count by count. It's important because of the victims, but you'll also know very much with the first verdict. When you hear that first verdict, you will know how this case is going to go, and you will not necessarily need to hear the rest of them. This is either a not guilty by reason of insanity case, or it's guilty, and it's almost certainly going to be guilty on all of those counts, at least the main charges as they stand now.
Again, you're looking at live pictures. This from the Boulder County Courthouse. Judge Ingrid Bakke has presided over the trial. She will provide today over this reading of the verdicts that are going to come down in just a few minutes. When they make that announcement, when the jurors let the judge know that they have in fact reached these verdicts, they then have to afford time for many people to make their way back to the courtroom. They've been told that it might be a quick call, that people need to get back, but family members as well as attorneys for both sides need to have time to make themselves available and get to the courtroom so that they can be present for this. There's always that interesting moment when people are waiting, and sometimes, in this case, they said specifically 1:25 the verdict would be read. It's obviously a little bit later than that, but it's that push to get families in there. The families deserve to hear this verdict read aloud live in court.
And those families are also going to hear his sentencing, because that was just confirmed as well. We know the verdicts will be read, and then Ahmad Alissa will also be sentenced today, and that happens in tandem. Is that usual?
And that's if he's guilty, and assuming that he is guilty. If it's not guilty by reason of insanity, there's one course. If it's guilty in these cases, it is not unusual for cases in Colorado, particularly murder cases, where you know what the decision has to be with a murder case. We're talking about life in prison. It's not unusual in a case like this to go immediately to sentencing. The question is, are there enough families, and do they feel represented enough? Because this is really the first opportunity for those families to speak in open court and talk about their loss. That's why sentencing hearings are so important. But at the same time, it is logistically difficult. So you would assume if they're moving on to sentencing that they've told the families in advance, this is what we're going to do. Again, we are awaiting that reading of these verdicts, or the verdict, if you will. In many cases, one may equal 55, as Chris was just alluding to once we get started here. But this is a case that, as you think about that day, that Monday in Boulder, and over the course of just over a minute, so many people were killed and injured. And then an hour later, Ahmad Alissa was being taken out by police. And that chaotic day that in some ways, as far as mass shootings, I think all of us in the media have become all too, not used to, but I guess prepared for, if you will.
Yeah, when those calls come into the newsroom, it just feels like, here we go, right? There's like a plan, a process that we do to cover it. But then, Tom, as you mentioned, like these are people's families and the emotions that are going to be going through this courtroom today. You can only imagine. We do want to get out live. We have our Kelly Rinke, who has been following this case for us. She is outside the courthouse. And Kelly, I understand there's a lot of emergency responders who are arriving at this time.
Yeah, hey, Alex, as we've been standing here, again, we got about an hour's notice before this verdict was going to be read off. And since then, we have seen a constant flow of Boulder police officers and Boulder firefighters that have been coming to this courthouse. But it looks like that verdict is going to be read in just a little bit. So we're going to toss it back to you guys.
All right, Kelly, thank you. Getting back to us quickly, because the judge has entered the courtroom, and we want to go live to see what's happening now.
Or if you'd like to stay, you're invited to stay right where you are with the rest of the jurors, and we can debrief in the back afterward. So it's really up to you. You now have completed your duties as alternate jurors in this case, and you are discharged with the thanks of everybody, including your community. Thank you so much. The question may arise whether you may now discuss this case with the lawyers or other persons. For your guidance, the court instructs you that whether you talk to anyone is entirely your decision. It is proper for others to discuss the case with you, and you may talk with them, but you need not. If you speak with them, you may tell them as much or as little about your role in this case. And anything about the case in terms of your decision, if you have one. If any person persists in the discussion of the case over your objection or becomes critical of your service, either before or after any discussion has begun, please report it to me, see what I can do, okay? With that, would you like to stay? Okay, and for the record, we have 3744 and 4137, thank you, and 3058. Our fourth alternate was sick today and I approved him not appearing. That's 2970. Also appreciate his time and attention. With that, then we'll bring in the jury, please.
So Judge Bakke, talking about what the jurors can and can't do now that this case has drawn to a close, they're being brought in now where they will, of course, be asked to hand over their jury to be read by Judge Ingrid Bakke.
They are still bringing in the jury. Now, keep in mind, there are 3 different verdicts that can be read for all 55 counts, and that is guilty, not guilty, or not guilty, by reason of insanity. Ahmad Alissa pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity for all of the counts. All right, we're still waiting. There's still no audio playing here inside of the courtroom. We're waiting for the jury to be seated, and that's when Judge Ingrid Bakke can hand down the verdict.
This is one of those moments when the jury walks in that everyone sort of looks at their faces and says, can they guess what they're thinking? And a lot of times will they look at the defendant, will they look at the attorneys, those type of sort of cues and tell them oftentimes. And I've seen that in court where you get those slight cues from the jury.
They are rising now for the preparatory statements. People have been trying to read this jury for a couple of weeks now, and now the jury has its answer.
You can see the defendant on the left side of your screen.
All right, please be seated. And good afternoon, everyone. I believe you're 3929, is that correct? So you're the foreperson. And it's our understanding that the jury has reached a unanimous verdict, is that correct? On all counts? All right. If you could tender that to Mr. Collins, please. Put this in front of the documents. Thank you. I'm going to remind everyone of the decorum order. If you need to leave the room, you're welcome to, but please no audible outbursts. All right, jury verdict, count number 1, as to Nevin Stanisic. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 1, murder in the first degree. Jury verdict, count number 2, as to Kevin Mahoney. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 2, murder in the first degree, indicating on all of these that there is a signature by the foreperson. Jury verdict, count number 3, Furlana Artkawiak. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 3, first-degree murder. Jury verdict, count number 4, Ricky Olds, murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 4, murder in the first degree. Jury verdict, count number 5, Denny Stong, murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 5, murder in the first degree. Jury verdict, count number 6, Lynn Murray, murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 6, murder in the first degree. Jury verdict, count number 7, Terry Leiker, murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 7, murder in the first degree. Jury verdict count number 8, Jody Waters, murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 8, murder in the first degree. Jury verdict count number 9, Suzanne Fountain, murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 9, murder in the first degree. Jury verdict count number 10, Eric Talley, murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 10, murder in the first degree. Jury verdict count number 11, Angela Peacock, extreme indifference, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 11, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. And yes, the prosecution did prove that the defendant used or possessed and threatened the use of a deadly weapon. Jury verdict count number 12, Casey Taylor, extreme indifference, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 12, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. And further, yes, the prosecution has proven that the defendant used or possessed and threatened the use of a deadly weapon. Jury verdict count number 13, Hayden Steele, extreme indifference, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 13, attempt to commit murder in the first degree, and further find that the prosecution did prove that the defendant used or possessed and threatened the use of a deadly weapon. Jury verdict count number 14, Kajendra Malla, extreme indifference, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 14, attempt to commit murder in the first degree, and further, the prosecution did prove that the defendant used or possessed and threatened the use of a deadly weapon. Jury verdict count number 15, Jacqueline Keaton, extreme indifference, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 15, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. And further, the prosecution did prove that the defendant used or possessed and threatened the use of a deadly weapon. Jury verdict count number 16, Paul Johnson, extreme indifference, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Ahmad Alissa guilty of count number 16, attempt to commit murder in the first degree. And further, the prosecution did prove that the defendant used or possessed and threatened the use of a deadly weapon.
As you may have imagined, with this verdict coming back so quickly, it is clear that Ahmad Alissa is going to be found guilty on all 55 of these counts. The only question had to do with sanity. The jury is determined that he was in fact sane on March 22nd of 2021 when he killed those 10 people and obviously injured and threatened so many more. But I think for me, sometimes I have to stop and remember that all of these people were in some ways randomly put together in a grocery store, from employees to customers who happened to be there at 2:30 on Monday, March 22nd, to Nevin Stanisic, who was just sitting outside in his van. He was the first to be killed, of course. But it's hard to sum up what happened, because so much happened in such a short span of time. And now, after this long span of time, this trial has come to a close. And it will be interesting to see if the family still have anything more to say about what happened, whether it was what happened that day or what's happened in 3 years as far as justice, or what happened today and what they saw. But again, these were the 10, including Officer Eric Talley, who obviously was there trying to prevent this from happening. But these others, many of them did know one another, and many of them had never met. And they were all cast together in this unfortunate blaze of violence some 3.5 years ago.
You know, we've seen their picture so often, but to see them now, I feel like it's almost sobering after we heard their names listed as counts in the verdict today. But as far as what this means for the person who took their life and changed their family's lives forever, now being found guilty for their murders, he will spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. And you just have to hope that that provides some level of peace, some level of justice for the families whose lives are forever changed.
There are 10 families that got that horrible news back in early 2021. Many of them may have even seen some of it on television. watching the news unfold on television, and then to get that phone call that people get in these situations. It tells them this horrible news, something that they had feared is now in fact true. And this brings some level, not complete, but some level of closure to some extent. And I hate that word closure, but it's legal closure, because what they've been through over the last few years has been nothing short of hell. This is awful.
From Columbine through James Holmes, through what we are witnessing today, you know, you see what happens, but you also understand the impact that this has on communities, how it resonates through people. But you've also, you know, talked to where you have to trace where did it come from in the person or people who commit these acts. And you also go through some of the legal aspects of tracing the weapons that are used and things like that, but that, you know, that they may be empty to those families that have lost loved ones, but some, even years later, continue to try to push for laws or other remedies that might change mental health and or gun laws or things like that. And days like this become, to some extent, they can be watershed moments for some.
Well, you think about, I think about back to Columbine, and there was this desire to sort of want to link all of the victims together as one sort of mass. And there's each individual unique stories from every family, and every family processes these things differently. And there's this tendency for us in the press to want to just call them all the victims. And what struck me about all of this is that they're individuals, and the individual families that have lost so much. And they have gone through all sorts of levels of grief, and they will feel this for the rest of their lives. Today helps to some extent, but when the trial is over, these are still difficult paths for families to go down, and it talks immeasurably about what happens to all of these families, to 10 of these families, to the other people that were in the grocery store at the time. This was a popular grocery store. This is a popular grocery store on the south side of Boulder. Lots of people have used it. Lots of people have gone to it. It was part of the community. It's been part of the community. And then to have this answer today is an answer, but it's not a full answer.
Yeah, that hashtag Boulder Strong we have seen so often, but I think it's so representative of, look at these images. I mean, all of the emotions back when people were still wearing masks outside, but they were still gathering together to be one community. For all the folks who went to this grocery store, and so many stories came out after this happened, and we got to know the victims, as you hate to call them and lump them up as to one, but we got to know them a little bit by all of their friends and families who had such beautiful things to say about them, and it just puts into perspective that it could have been someone that you know, and for a lot of people, it was someone they know and someone that they love that were victims to this terrifying tragedy.
Judge Ingrid Bakke continues to read the verdicts, which are all guilty, unanimous on all counts, as she said when talking about what the jurors had returned. They are now in the mid-30s. There will be 55 of these read. They will all read the same. And with word now that sentencing will follow, I would think sentencing will be rather pro forma at this point. The only thing a judge or anyone would be wary of would be creating any daylight for an appeal, but it would seem we know what's coming.
Yeah, this is set in stone. The judge does not have options here. This is going to be a life in prison sentence, and that's what will happen. The only question is how many families will choose to speak. Sentencing hearings are really a powerful moment for families because in many ways, throughout the court process, they're really not allowed to speak. They're not allowed to speak to the judge. They're not allowed to speak to the jury. And this becomes their first moment where the person that they loved, the person that they cared for, the news that they got back in March of 2021, that they can make it public and say what they want. It can be a very, very powerful thing for a family.
Those who lost their voice that day will have a voice at sentencing hearings. Kelly Ranke, of course, has been covering the trial. She is there in Boulder, and we're talking about an area that was so impacted and remains so impacted, Kelly, and I'm sure today a very important day there.
Yeah, Tom, as soon as that alert went out that the verdict was going to be read in about 45 minutes, we started to see a stream of police officers, Boulder police officers who worked with Eric Talley, arrive here at the courthouse. And soon after that stream of police officers, we started to see those first responders, people who may have very well been at the grocery store responding to that shooting almost 4 years ago. As that verdict was being read, you could see the family sitting right behind the prosecution having a very emotional reaction, understandably. They have been waiting a very long time for this. There have been so many delays with this case due to the defendant's competency issues, and now they finally have an answer, and at least on the legal side, a little bit of closure with this case. Again, this was a 2-week trial, and this jury deliberated for about 6 hours in total since Friday afternoon, and they made this decision very quickly. It may have been in part because the defense never offered a single expert to say that their client was insane during the time of the shooting. Instead, the prosecution brought forward 2 experts, 2 psychologists who had concluded that he was sane at the time of the shooting, which essentially just means that he knew the difference between right and wrong. And so as soon as that verdict will wrap up, we're going to start to see some of those first responders and especially those family members coming outside the courtroom. So if any do want to speak to us, we'll be sure to make sure that their words are shared. But definitely an emotional few weeks that are now wrapping up.
People, I think, had the opportunity to prepare for this trial, as difficult it was going to be for family members, even for the prosecution, defense, everyone in that courtroom. The jurors were selected. They didn't necessarily sign up to have to watch all this story play out because it's a hard story to watch. The jury will also be a very interesting group to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was speaking to a few of the employees at King Soopers who were working the day of the shooting, who were telling me that they were also watching from afar, keeping very close attention, because for them, this was also important for them to see this process and to see the end of this case. They've been waiting a long time for this too. And although they may not have been physically injured that day, they're definitely traumatized from that day years later. And so it was so important for them to see a guilty verdict today. They said it definitely made a difference to them that this defendant was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Kelly, thanks. Of course, we'll have more from Kelly Ranke in Boulder. Kevin Vaughn, who's been covering the trial, is also going to join us in Boulder. But right now, our 9 News legal analyst, Whitney Traylor, is with us. And before we get too specific on this, just your overall reaction. I don't think too many people are too surprised with this verdict.
No, I'm not surprised, and I'm not surprised at how long it took them. In some respects, this is a fast verdict in light of the amount of evidence that they heard, but in another respect, it really isn't, knowing that they went through it thoroughly, they thought it through, and of course the issues were really just related to his sanity. And the prosecution laid out a nice job in terms of how methodical he was that day, some of the decisions he had made. He went to work the day before, he dropped his brother off. There was all this normalcy, and of course the people he went after were only the ones that were running. So that shows some sense of deliberated intent, and of course that goes to the insanity defense. So I'm not surprised. I think it would have been difficult for a jury to come back with some other verdict knowing that this happened, even with the insanity defense. And we know that it doesn't work often. Less than 1% of cases, I think, are successful. And of course, the last few in Colorado were major mass shootings, and they were all unsuccessful.
We want to get more of your analysis, but we are going to return to the Boulder County Courthouse now, because they are now just getting into the charges 50 through 55, meaning these final verdicts will be read, and then we'll see what the process is after that. So let's go back and listen in Boulder.
During the commission of murder in the first degree, as defined. Jury verdict count number 51, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 51, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. And further, the defendant did possess the large capacity magazine during the commission of a specific crime, the commission of murder in the first degree as defined. Jury verdict count number 52, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 52, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. The defendant did possess the large capacity magazine during the commission of a specific crime, crime of murder in the first degree as defined. Jury verdict count number 53, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 53, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. The defendant did possess the large capacity magazine during commission of a specified crime, murder in the first degree as defined. Jury verdict count number 54, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 54, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. The defendant did possess the large capacity magazine during the commission of a specified crime, murder in the first degree as defined. Jury verdict count number 55, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ahmad Alissa, guilty of count number 55, possession of a large capacity magazine during the commission of a felony. The defendant did possess the large capacity magazine during the commission of a specified crime, murder in the first degree as defined. And juror number 3929. Are those your personal verdicts? Okay, I'm going to go through the rest of your juror numbers just in the order that they appear on my list, and I'll be asking each of you that same question. Juror number 3238, raise your hand. Were those your verdicts? Juror number 3743, raise your hand. Were those your verdicts? Juror number 3852, raise your hand. Were those your verdicts? Juror number 3712, raise your hand. Sir, were those your verdicts? Juror number 3129, were those your verdicts, ma'am? Juror number 4106, were those your verdicts? Juror number 3735, sir, were those your verdicts? And juror 2886, ma'am, were those your verdicts? How about 4357, ma'am, were those your verdicts? And juror 4116, sir, were those your verdicts? And last 2890, ma'am, were those your verdicts?
You hear the jury individually answering to the verdicts read, and Whitney Trailer, you were talking about this during the break, that's not always how it's done, but in this case, it seems like they want to, go through every step and make sure everything's done the correct way.
Yeah, and if they didn't, sometimes the judge can voluntarily say we're going to poll each of the jurors, but a lot of times it's the losing side, so that each juror has to come through and say, yes, this was my decision, and I reached it voluntarily. And of course, what they're also doing is setting as much setup as they can for a potential appeal, because if they don't raise an issue at trial, they essentially waive that right on appeal.
We're talking, Judge Bakke is now, I think, giving the jury the thank you for their service, and also saying that they can, in fact, talk about the case now. And it will be interesting to see if any of them do. Many cases, the jurors like to disappear. And in many cases, the jurors want to tell their story about what they saw, felt, or knew about the trial as it unfolded. So we will see in which way these jurors do, in fact, go.
Yeah, the emotional toll, I think, that even they took for 2 weeks, right, of hearing painstaking detail of what happened on that day in those minutes. The 10 deaths, the other people who suffered at the hands of this man as well.
Yeah.
So the jury is now leaving, so they rise as the jury is thanked for their service. We've been talking about sentencing as to follow, and we were talking about it with Chris a few minutes ago. It seems like there's not much question as to how this sentencing will go. No,
I think the only unique aspect of it was that they agreed to do the sentencing immediately afterwards. But no, it looks like it'll be life without the possibility of parole. But we will find out now. The judge does the sentencing, and as I understand it, they're going to do that now.
And as we talk about life, again, that's the now convicted Ahmad Alissa was on the left, who has never looked his age, if you will, but he is now just 25 years old. He will certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. He was 21 when he committed the crime, now convicted on those 10 counts of first-degree murder and 45 other charges. But that sentencing, Chris, does that add to any satisfaction? In this case, it's not. There's no variance, no vagary.
No, and there's a critical difference, obviously, between this case and the theater shooting case. Is that in the theater shooting case, back in 2015, when the theater shooter was sentenced in that case, there was a death penalty option on the table. In this case, there is no death penalty option on the table, so it's in essence preordained what's going to happen. Yes, it's good for the families to sort of get that answer that this person will spend the rest of his life in prison. Just like the theater shooter, I would imagine that the state will have to move this person out of state. They've done that in the past. They did that with a theater shooter. And in this case, you could expect something similar to happen. This is a high-profile inmate now that's going to be soon going into the Colorado Department of Corrections system.
Whitney, this case has always been about sanity, and not for these families and not for many people in Boulder. It was about justice as far as their loss. But sanity has always been something I think the courts have struggled with, and we've seen it in cases here as well, especially when you're talking about someone who walked into a supermarket and killed 10 people. It's hard to say, well, that person seems perfectly sane.
Right, and I think the prosecutor mentioned that when he said, well, this is abnormal behavior, but that doesn't necessarily make it insane. And of course, the legal definition is, can you distinguish right from wrong at the time of the shooting? And so while this is abnormal, to use the prosecutor's word, there is, I could understand the thought that, hey, if you did this was so far abnormal that you would have to be insane to do that. But as the jury came back with today, that was not the case. And of course, part of the prosecution, as I mentioned earlier, was, okay, what was his conduct leading up to it, the day before, even right before the shooting, dropping his brother off. But of course, obeying traffic lights, showing up to work, still doing these normal functioning things. And I think the prosecutor also highlighted some things in terms of his behavior early on as he was investigating how to do a mass shooting, some of the things like that. He said to one of the investigators, January and February I wasn't ready, but March I felt ready. So there was some suggestion that he had a premeditated mindset, and that obviously came to bear in this verdict.
Yeah, interesting, premeditated, yet still no motive, still not able to determine what was the cause of all of this. And that's got to be such a disturbing piece to take with you, even with this amount of justice today, with the guilty on all 55 counts. We know this man will never step foot outside of prison again in his life, but for the families to know that this was all for what?
Yeah, and I think that's, now, as you all said, this part of the saga is over, and now the healing can begin. But really that question, and I think that question would have been amplified had it came back with a not guilty because of insanity. But the question of why and how you get closure when there really is no why.
Sanity being that hurdle that you face in court, there's also competency.
Yes.
And we see that like in the Planned Parenthood shooter down in Colorado Springs, Robert Deere. The question of whether you are or not competent to stand trial is another hurdle.
That was another hurdle, and that explains why there was these significant delays, because competency is a different standard, and competency is related to, can you participate in the presentation of your defense? Do you understand the charges that are being levied against you, what the potential consequences are? And he was not deemed competent, and so they had a number of hearings that ultimately resulted in him being forcibly medicated, and that was what led to his actual competence. And I was actually a little bit concerned about that, because in the institution in Pueblo, they were giving him his forced medication. But when he came up to jail to stand for trial, those folks weren't authorized to give him his medication. So I didn't know if not being on that medication during that 2 week would have created some abnormal behavior or potentially led to him not being competent. And there's an issue in the law. Do you have to be competent through trial, or is it just at the time that they
get to trial?
Correct. Do you have to remain competent throughout the whole trial? And I think for the most part the answer is no. If you're competent at the competency hearing and they start the trial, and that's what happened here.
Well, we've been told it's going to be about 15 minutes before they start with sentencing in the courtroom there. So we're going to continue to discuss what happened and take a look at what is happening in Boulder. Again, our Kevin Vaughn is there. He's been covering the trial and this case for years now. And of course, Kelly Reinke, you've seen her. She'll be back with us as well. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back with more on the news today that the shooter in the King Soopers trial has been found guilty on all counts. We're breaking into programming again to cover the conclusion of the trial of the Boulder King Soopers shooter. Tom Green, along with Alex Lewis, Chris Vanderveen has joined us as well, and our 9 News legal analyst Whitney Traylor. We want to take you back to the Boulder courtroom, where about an hour ago, Ahmad Alissa was in fact found guilty. A unanimous verdict from the jury, all counts, 55 of them, including 10 counts of first-degree murder. He will be sentenced later this afternoon or possibly tomorrow to life in prison. But before that, there are steps that have to happen. So the courtroom has reconvened. Whitney, talk about what we're likely to see now. The verdict is in. They took a short break. What are the next steps?
Well, as I understand it, they agreed to start sentencing immediately. So that process may begin, or I think more likely is that they're going to have victim impact statements. And so they probably have an idea, both the prosecution and defense, of who's going to speak, but many times that's not necessarily a formal list, so they could say, who wants to speak and allow them that opportunity. There were a lot of victims here, from the folks who survived to the family members of the victims to the shoppers that day. So this could be an extensive process.
So DA Michael Doherty has brought one woman up to the podium right now, so we do want to listen in to some of this.
Describe how I am feeling and what I want to state. This statement is also on the behalf of my parents as well. First and foremost in this statement, I think it's important to talk about who Nevin was. Nevin is not just another statistic of people who have lost their lives in a mass shooting. Nevin was also a person. Nevin had a life that he loved. He had people who he cherished and things he loved doing. He was just like any of us sitting in this courtroom today. The only thing is his life had been cut short without him even having a say in what happened to him or his life. That is why the majority of this statement will be about Nevin and who he was. He can no longer tell his story, but that doesn't mean that my parents and I cannot tell his story for him. Who he was will always live through us. We will not stop talking about him. I don't have to? Oh, okay. Nevin had been the first child of our parents, Radmilo and Mirjana Stanisic. They had him 1 year after they immigrated to the States. Something that sticks with me that my parents continuously say is Nevin je moja prva radost I prva tuga. That translates to Nevin was their first joy, first happiness, and their first sadness and heartbreak. No parent should have to grieve as I have watched my parents grieve over my brother. No parent should have to lose their child, especially in this way. No parent should have to bury their child 6 feet underground. My parents shouldn't have gone through this. My dad shouldn't have looked for my brother for over 7 hours, trying to see if he was alive, only to be told if he hadn't responded, then he was dead. My mom and I shouldn't have had to watch the news for over 7 hours, trying to see if we hear anything about him. Our parents always told stories about how when Nevin was a child, he loved playing with tools that our dad had. He would try to fix things around the apartment that they had lived in. There is a photo of Nevin when he was probably around 1 or 2, where he was holding a screwdriver and smiling. As he grew, he loved to take things apart and then try to put them back together. One of the stories I remember is our dad bought him a new Razor scooter. Nevin had it for 2 weeks before he dismantled it while our parents were at work. He even cut the wires. He tried to see if he could put it back together, which he couldn't. It was completely ruined. Through his teenage years and eventually into his early adulthood, his love for fixing things, most notably machines, only grew. Out of high school, Dad, they would travel all around the state to fix coffee machines. In the weeks before him being killed, I remember one day he came home from work and his hands were completely stained blue from working on a slushy machine. He always found a way to get dirty, as our parents would say. Nevin had been my only sibling. We only had each other. As we grew older, we started to rely on each other more. He had become one of my best friends. I wish I got to tell him that more. I was very lucky to have had him as my older brother. He was always looking out for me. Even the same could be said when it came to our parents. When he started working, he would always try to help them with bills in any way he could. If I wanted to get ice cream with him, he would take me to get some, even if it was 9 p.m. I was lucky to have a brother who was so caring and who wanted me to succeed in anything that I wanted to do. We could talk to each other and tell jokes and even talk about some of the similar interests that we had. On Sunday night, the night before he was killed, we got to get ice cream together. I remember it being super spontaneous and it had been late. It was probably 9 p.m. Despite that, he had taken me to get ice cream. I would get a chocolate cone, and he would get a shake that had a little bit of coffee in it. That was the last time we got to hang out, and honestly, that had been the last time I saw him. In the car, he had told me about his plans for the upcoming week. He wanted to paint the basement and to hang out with his friends over the weekend. He never got to do either of those. He never got to do anything that he had planned to do. He never got to see us, his friends, or anyone else ever again. Nevin was such a caring, kind, and selfless person. He always looked out for those around him. He always made sure that they were okay before making sure he was okay. He loved going on hikes with his friends. He loved playing video games. He was someone who just loved life. He is someone who had an impact on so many people's lives. That much is clear seeing how many people were heartbroken over what had happened to him. There is so much to take away and to learn from who Nevin was. There is something that everyone could learn from him. He had been someone who was one of a kind. Nevin had his last birthday a month and 10 days before he was killed. He only got to be 23 for a month. When we think about our 20s, we think about living some of the best years that we will ever have. We think about living our youth and figure out who we are and who we want to be. Nevin wasn't able to do that. His youth, his life now cut short. When I think about how in October I will turn 23, my heart wants to break. How is a younger sibling supposed to become the same age as their older sibling? How is that fair? When we think about Nevin and him getting shot 5 times, our heart breaks. Just thinking about him and what he went through makes me want to cry and scream into a void. My parents have to live the rest of their lives knowing that their child has left this earth before them. That they have to somehow live without him. In no world should this be okay. In no world should parents have to bury their child because they were killed. In no world should we have to lose loved ones to mass shootings. To say our life has turned upside down would be an understatement. I don't even have words to describe how much our life has changed. Our life without Nevin is not a complete whole life. There is someone who is always missing, and that is him. In our household before, we would always talk to each other and laugh, and now there's barely anything to talk and laugh about. Most days it's silent. For as long as we are alive, we will talk about him and who he was. He deserves to be mentioned whenever possible. Just because he is in here doesn't mean that who he was should die too. In the end, I truly hope that he is somewhere out there and is okay. There are no words that could describe how much we love and miss him. There are no words to describe the grief that comes with when losing someone like this. I think for the rest of our lives, we will be asking why. When the defense attorneys mentioned Nevin's name in their slide during the closing statement, I felt angry. To use Nevin's name as some sort of gotcha moment because he could not run away or hide, to me, is crazy. Nevin could not do any of that because he was ready to leave. He had his seatbelt on, and the company received a signal that his car was on for a few seconds. I think it's shameful to use a victim, my brother, as a pawn to try to prove a point. If Nevin had a chance to do either of those options, he would have, but he didn't. Wouldn't Nevin try to save his life if he could? To the person who had done this, we have very few words for you. We hope that you suffer for the rest of your life. You are a coward. In your next life.
It's okay. Just do it.
Oh, I can't write.
It's okay.
Okay. I hope this haunts the defendant until the end of time. The defendant deserves the absolute worst. We wish 10 times the amount of pain and suffering just so the defendant feels even an ounce of the pain that was inflicted onto Nevin that day.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
We've been listening to Nicolina Stanisic, the younger sister of Nevin Stanisic, and his count was the first count read today, about an hour ago. He was the first killed on that day back in March of 2021, and obviously the impact on the families comes through in statements like that. And it also, I think Nicolina has had years to think about this, but when you get up there and you speak, you could feel that emotion rise even further than maybe it had before.
I can't even imagine what it was like for her to have to speak. My heart is pounding listening to her words and to hear and learn a little bit more about Nevin from his own sister. That sibling love certainly came out, some of the things that she said. Number one, I'll always be asking why. This is a family like so many others who will always be asking why this happened to their loved one. As the impact statements continue to go on throughout the afternoon, we do want to check in with our Kelly Rinke, though, who has been following this trial and who, as we understand, Kelly, you've recently spoke to the shooter's brother after he found out his brother will spend the rest of his life in jail.
Yeah, so Alex, after that verdict was read, shortly after, members of the shooter's family walked outside of this courtroom, and we were able to speak one-on-one with the shooter's older brother, who tells us that they had no indication that he was going to do something like this. They really have not been at the trial many days. Actually, they had testified during a portion of this trial as part of the defense witnesses, and one of the reasons is because the defense attorneys did not call up a single expert to say that he was insane during the time of the shooting. So they heavily relied on the family's testimony to say what his personality was like in the years and months leading up to the shooting. I asked his older brother if he had any indication he was going to do this. Here's what he told me.
We were in the front line. If we knew that he was dangerous, then he was going to be dangerous to us first before anyone else. We did not know anything about sickness. We saw him changing through the course of 3 years. His sickness started to become normal to us, that he is antisocial.
His mother, as she was walking outside of the courtroom, at one point she made a gesture to us, pointing at her head and giving the okay signal, almost indicating to us that he was not, insane during the time of the shooting. The family understands that he did a horrible, horrible thing, but they do believe that he should have been found not guilty by reason of insanity. Much more of that conversation with that older brother, and hopefully we can share more of that later on in the afternoon, Alex.
All right, Kelly, thank you for that.
I think as we went back to the courtroom after they took about a 30-minute break following the verdicts being read before these victim impact statements to be followed by sentencing, one transition we saw was with the shooter himself, going from a dress shirt into the orange and white jumpsuit, now as a convicted felon, no longer the defendant. He is now going into the system. These victim impact statements, which are continuing, and we'll carry those for you on 9 News Plus, as well as at 9news.com if you'd like to watch them. It might take some time, but these are incredibly compelling.
And they're really difficult, but they're also valuable, I think, for family members to really get that first time where they can tell a judge what they've been through over the last few years and months, and who their loved one was, and not just sort of a name that's sort of read aloud in court on occasion, or sort of a picture in a newspaper or a picture on a newscast, but an actual person. And it's really their first chance to do that in front of a judge. And that's why that moment is so powerful. And you oftentimes will see a member of a family want to address the defendant directly. And you saw that just a few minutes ago, where there's that desire to be like, this is what you've done to my life. And judges are really trying to keep it disciplined in those environments. And it's really tough to do, but they want it, the conversation to be between the judge and the family member, and it's difficult. This is going to be a difficult afternoon for so many family members, and I hope there's some value in it as well for them.
Whitney, the victim impact statement, the word impact is not trying to impact the judge or impact the sentencing. This is the impact the victims and the victims' families felt, right?
Yes, it is. And these situations, I've been in the courtroom during these victim impact statements, and it's you can hear a pin drop, and it is fully emotional. It's, I mean, I was getting a little choked up just watching this. You actually felt these family members' pain. And in many respects, it's cathartic. This is their opportunity to say in public, to let this person know this is the impact you've had on me. But this is obviously a years-long process to try and find any normalcy. But this is, there is a cathartic aspect for the family being able to speak, and then the judge will certainly take all of this into consideration.
And not saying he would, because we have not ever heard his voice, but is there an opportunity for Ahmad Alissa and his family to speak?
Yes, and you know, in the family, you heard the brother there, and I've seen some of the statements from the family's testimony, and I think there's a little bit of a sense of defensiveness. You know, at one point they were asked, the father was asked, well, why didn't you ever report it? And he said, well, he had a gun and he possessed it lawfully. But that sort of ignores the extreme isolation, the change in behavior, you know, he no longer had friends, building up, buying so many weapons, and even some bomb-making material, I guess, was in his room as well. So all of these things together, I could see how the family would feel somewhat defensive, and I sense that's a little bit of what they're experiencing, and of course some guilt. And so all around, you look at these situations, not only mass shooting, just a murder, and it impacts so many people, and including the jury, the people who saw it. I mean, the jury's not going to ever forget what they went through. So this has such a community-wide, societal-wide impact, these acts.
It has been 3.5 years, almost to the day, since that awful Monday in March of 2021, the Boulder King Soopers shooting. Today, the verdict, soon to come, the sentencing. As we speak, the victim impact statements continue. We do want to let you know, if you want to watch those, they will be available at 9 News Plus as well as on 9news.com. Of course, we will have much more on this later in the day, but it's also time to reflect on those 10 people who suddenly lost their lives on March 22nd of 2021. I want to take a look at them as we end our breaking report here. Of course, we'll have much more coming up at 3 o'clock and 4 and 5 on 9 News this afternoon.